Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum. This is our third talk on the Silk Road, past, present and future. In the first one, we saw how the Silk Road initially originated as a route from the silk and spices of the east to the west here. And we also saw that most of the route passed through Muslim countries, and so it was literally controlled by Muslims. In the last part, we saw the development of alternative routes. So once the European explorers, mainly Spanish and Portuguese at that time, started to develop an alternative sea route to the east. Obviously, sea route in that time is a much more efficient route than a land route, which was based on horses, donkey caravans, and so on, which was quite a complex route. The sea route could bring things much more faster and cheaper. So today we want to see how this business of the sea route developed further and where it led to. So if you look at 1550, which is roughly when the idea of the sea route started, these were the global powers in that time. Mainly, you see, this was the Ottoman Empire, and then these were Spanish colonies here, some here, Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and that's it. So most of the rest of the world was more or less for themselves. You must remember that when the Silk Route was across the roads, across the land routes here, there was no colonization. It was mostly trade. And of course, quite a lot of conversion, but no colonization. Now, as the sea routes started, you can see the development of the first sea route, obviously, we saw last time was to the Americas, which Columbus discovered, and then the Spanish and Portuguese took advantage and brought a lot of silver and gold from the Americas to try to trade across to Asia. Now, Portuguese sailors, especially Vasco da Gama and others, they devised an alternative route round the Cape of Good Hope, then first to India and then to the Far East as well. And you can see that even today in India, for example, this is a Portuguese colony. So you will still see the Goan people there who are Catholic and speak Portuguese as well. Or you have Portuguese colonies across all over here. You have this Fort Jesus in Mombasa, which we mentioned last time, and so on. These were all staging posts. The problem with this structure, you can see here, is that the Spanish and the Portuguese were gaining ground. And other peoples, especially the British and the Dutch, who had been involved in trade before, were nearly left out. So what they started to do is to see if we could somehow plunder most of the ships which were carrying silk and spices or gold from the west. And so people like Sir Walter Raleigh were essentially pirates. They used to plunder the ships and bring the loot home. So they didn't want to go to the difficult route. But eventually, they figured out that they have to go as well to the east. So now you started a new phase of people beginning to take advantage of this. And so we can see here, for example, now, all the other shipping routes coming right around the world, people trying to trade. Now you can see that this bit now, the original route is completely left out. There is nothing. All the trade is now going through there. Now, this new phase did not stop at only trading. They started to have bigger ideas. bigger and more sinister ideas. They started to colonize places which they were trading on. So you had companies like the East India Company, which is well known in India, or the Dutch East India Company, which is well known in the Netherlands. These companies started to blossom into colonial empires. So East India Company, based in Calcutta, eventually became the vanguard of British colonialism in India. Dutch East India Company became the vanguard of colonialism in Indonesia. The Spanish colonized Philippines. The Portuguese colonized parts of Africa, and then everybody else colonized the rest of Africa. So really, this new phase brought a complete loss of independence to those countries. They were no longer trading partners. They became places for exploitation. There are many, many episodes in these things which can be discussed, but we don't have time. Things like the opium trade from India to China, which was designed to drug China into submission. You had the Bengal famine, which resulted from diverting all the grain of that country to Europe during the war, and so on. So you had many phases like this, and eventually we ended up, you can see here, with a world which was completely colonized by different powers. On that side, these are the different powers, or you can see here as well, same thing, that the world was completely colonized. This is in 1945, spheres of influence, no independence to anybody. There were 4 or 5 big powers. Of course, 1945, Germany was defeated, so the German colonies were taken over by the British. And so you had the American sphere of influence. Spain and Portugal had been eased out except for small pockets. Britain and the Netherlands still had Indonesia. And the Russians started to come down, took over all the Central Asian states, and formed what they call the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Of course, later on, these people split up out. So what we have here, sorry, if we can go, I can go. This is where we started, as a land route, dominating most of the trade in those times. This is going back to like 700 AD to 1400 AD. And slowly, as an alternative route was discovered, instead of this, we ended up on this trade. Trade is fine as long as it was trade, but then trade gave way to this. So we see at the end of the Second World War, most of the world colonized by 3 or 4 powers, being exploited, and a system being put into place to keep that exploitation going. Of course, the cost of the war, Second World War, was so big that these powers could no longer sustain that thing, and eventually the countries started to gain independence either by fighting or by loss of will on the part, or otherwise, like in Vietnam, by really terrible fighting and to throw the Americans out from there. And then, of course, communism also came from the Soviet Union and captured the other bits. China became communist, and that's where we were at the conclusion of the Second World War. So next time we want to see what happens after the Second World War, where we go and where we are heading now. Perhaps we are heading back to the Silk Road, because what is happening is that at the moment, say, to bring a container ship from China to Europe will take you about 35 days, 35 to 50 days, depending on which route and how the vessel is. Already, a train from China to Europe can come in 19 days. And with the new developments, It could come in 11 days. So you could see the cost effectiveness with that. Now the train, these trains are a kilometer long. Now that train can carry as much as a shipload, right? And if it's coming in 1/3 of the time, the whole equation changes. So next time we want to look at what is happening there. Assalamu alaikum.